Welcome, the American Intelligence Media. My name is Douglas Gabriel. I'm your host, and today I have a most interesting person with me, Professor Thomas Horan, who has, in fact, decoded the Zodiac killer's cryptogram. The second one, which has gone to this day unencrypted and still one of the greatest mysteries of our times. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Douglas. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to do a little backdrop for who you are. You're an author. You have 3 books on the Zodiac killers where you've gone through every basic presentation that there is and all the accusations of who it might have been, and you've researched all of that. So as I was looking at those on Amazon, it looked as though you are one of the most thorough researchers of this subject to begin with.
I would dare to say I know more about the Zodiac mystery than any of the so-called self-proclaimed experts. The only person who alive today who I think might know more is Robert Graysmith, and I'm bringing him up first because the first thing I discovered, I wasn't even looking at the Zodiac killer. I was doing research for a project. These days I'm a semi-retired English professor, and I was looking for a project, and I thought the Zodiac killer letters and their place in the history of news media would be an interesting project. And it just came to pass that as I started doing that research, the original police department files, lab reports, autopsy reports from those original murders in the North Bay area of the 1960s, those became available for review. And I couldn't help noticing that Robert Graysmith had very definitely had access to those case files like he claimed, but the problem was he had lied about 90%. So I got curious and started looking further, and I realized that he told a lot of different kinds of lies. And the most interesting lie to me, what concerned the so-called credibility of those letters, those famous letters that were written to the San Francisco Chronicle and some cryptograms, some coded messages, that Graysmith had lied about the credibility and authenticity of those letters. And I thought, why on earth would he lie about a thing like that? So I just kept looking and comparing the letters and the newspaper articles to these actual police files and lab reports and things, and I realized that the letters were some kind of a hoax. Now, I don't mean like a prank or a joke, but it was obvious. A couple of things became obvious. Number one, the person who wrote the first 4 letters had access to some of those police files that I was looking at. And what was interesting was a lot of the information in his letters that Graysmith claimed was verified by police was actually wrong information. But it wasn't randomly wrong information. It was wrong information that had made its way into certain of those police reports. And another big lie that Graysmith told was that the different police departments in that area, Napa County, Vallejo, Solano County, supposedly none of these police agencies were sharing information on these murder cases. Well, that was absolutely not true. Part of the problem was there had been this big push prompted by the FBI to kind of push the police departments to share more information with each other, which they were doing anyway. But they were sharing reports on these murders with each other. And so it became obvious that the person writing those letters had access to some of these files. And it was also important to keep in mind the dates of the letters. So this was during certain periods of time. Certain people having access to these files would be able to create these letters. And it was also obvious that the person writing the letters was reading certain newspapers and was not aware of articles published in other newspapers. That narrowed down the search to Napa County. So it was someone in Napa County who had access to these police department files at certain times. And there was one particular deputy at the Napa County Sheriff's Office. He was their crime scene expert. Napa had their own crime lab, and in 1969 that was very rare. Only San Francisco and Napa had their own crime labs. So the guy who ran the crime lab in Napa is a genius, a self-taught genius, a guy named Hal Snook. He had been receiving copies of these reports, and you can actually, some of them are addressed, attention Hal Snook. So I got a copy of some handwritten material of his from 1969, And the handwriting turned out to be an absolutely perfect match for the handwriting on the first 4 Zodiac letters.
Well, then
So
you discovered what all the police were trying to really hide. Because
right, and it turns
sounds
out
like a conspiracy, what you're talking about here.
Well, it turns out in real life, somebody must have caught on to what he was doing, because after the first 4 letters, the first letter, a copy of that letter was sent to 3 different newspapers, and then he immediately followed that up with another letter to the Examiner, and then he followed that up with 2 letters about the Stein shooting in October 1969 in San Francisco. So those first 4 letters are in a very distinctive handwriting, and that is absolutely Hal Snook's handwriting, and that's corroborated not only by the fact that he had access to the information needed to create the letters, but as I'll get to later, there are so many more facts about him that prove he wrote these letters. But after those first 4 letters, in November 1969, the California Department of Justice, there was a task force headed by Mel Nikolai, who requested that all these police departments make copies of their files and send them to him. So they did, and at that time, Richard Lonergan, who was the lead detective on the case, the famous case, the stabbing of the 2 kids at Lake Berryessa, he slipped in a sample of Hal Snook's handwriting in with the reports he sent to the Department of Justice in California, and from that moment on, you can tell very distinctively, it's very easy to see, someone else took over writing the Zodiac letters. Now, after a certain period of time, there are some letters, and some of them aren't signed Zodiac. There's the famous letter about, put Count Marco back in the hole from whence it came. That looks like it's in Snook's handwriting. But the first 4 letters, absolutely for sure. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Hal Snook wrote those letters. And Graysmith lied about that when he wrote his book. And then as I found out more about Robert Graysmith and his relationship to Hal Snook, it became obvious what his role in this was as well.
So simply because you're a good investigator and you had some time for the investigation and all the evidence to kind of go through what it went through, so you could then reflect upon it. And when you looked at the whole thing, it led you directly to someone who you could confirm through graphology was your suspect, and that then appears in your books as a counterpoint to the first person who, Graysmith, who you had mentioned. It's Robert Graysmith, is it?
Right, that's his pen name. His real name is Robert Smith Jr., or sometimes styled Robert Smith II, and that turned out to be very interesting when we started decrypting those ciphered messages.
Now, the ciphered messages, for those who don't know, because this was happening when I was in junior high school, you see, and I think everyone in the world saw that the Zodiac Killer was able to manipulate the media in a way that had never happened before, and in a way turned it into its own weapon and use the media as a way of terrorizing the people in the Bay Area all the way into Northern California by saying, if we don't print this, then the Zodiac Killer is going to go kill a dozen people this weekend. I mean, this was the most amazing case. Supposedly, in the end, Zodiac Killer claims 37, perhaps, people killed or by the Zodiac Killer or killers. And this involvement and accusations of so many other people, but the point is there was a code, the 408, and then there was the code that was the 340. So the first code was broken. The second code wasn't broken. You broke it with your help, which you're going to tell us about in a minute, how you did that amazing thing. And then when you got the second code broken, that should open the codes to the other 2 or other places where he even says, I'm going to tell you my name, and then it gives an encoded message. So are you saying, now don't give away don't give away the who you now know because of the decryption is the killer, or at least one of the killers, because the killers in the Zodiac Killer did exactly what they said. In the encrypted cryptogram is the name of the killer, and I'm looking at the decoded cryptogram here that you have provided for me, and it says who it is. Matter of fact, it says a lot more than who it is, and it's a very clear message. Now, just to point this out, the person you mentioned who wrote one of the first supposed definitive books, was also working with people who thought they had broken the code, and they came up with even a name. In one case, I looked at those codes and I looked at the decryption, and they were just awful. They were just garbage. But one of them at the end did have a name, and that person was not really found to be a person of much interest. The police looked at that person, and then other names came out, and the police looked at those people. But the name you just named, that one didn't come out, did it? This person you just
no,
mentioned?
Right, and just to clarify, most of the people listening to this are going to know there were several cryptograms. The first one was mailed in 3 parts. One part went to the Chronicle, one part went to the San Francisco Examiner, although they were owned by the same company, and one part went to the Vallejo Times-Herald, which was the biggest distribution newspaper outside of San Francisco. And the letters, the author of the letters never demanded that the letters be published. He only demanded that the cryptograms be published on the front page. So they did. And the first one came in 3 parts. That totals 408 coded characters. So people call that the 408. Later on, with the dripping pin card, and now another problem with this is the San Francisco Chronicle never told the same story twice about which letter contained which cryptogram and which letter contained which piece of bloody shirt. But supposedly it was either in the dripping pin card or it came with the bus bomb letter. And the 4th letter. So those are the 2 ciphers. The one, there's at least a surface meaning in the 408. It was a fairly simple substitution cipher that was cracked within a couple of days by a high school teacher and his wife. And that's the one people are familiar with. The decoded message seems to say, I like killing people because it's so much fun, et cetera, et cetera. Then he mentions, the best part is when I die, I'll be reborn in paradise, and the blank I have killed will become my slaves. And that's a reference to an obscure cult of warriors in the South Pacific, and that turns out to be a major clue. Now, the more famous unsolved cipher is 340 characters long. A lot of the same characters, there are a few different characters. Supercomputers, the NSA claims they never cracked it. Now, remember, the NSA is not in the business of giving out information, so we take that with a grain of salt. Some people, including Graysmith, have put up potential decryptions. Now, we just recently, in the last few days, I've worked with a couple of different groups. I'm not a cryptography expert, but I've worked with some people who are. And independently, we've come up with 2 very similar decryptions, so I'm just waiting till we get some real hardcore official confirmation. Now, getting back to the 408 that was supposedly decrypted, there's a string of 18 characters at the end of the message. They might be a string of null characters just to fill out the block, but Graysmith claimed it was an anagram that spelled out the name Robert Emmett the Hippie, which is not true. If you look at the actual 408 yourself in the hardened solution, it actually spells out the name Robert E. Smith II. And what's interesting about that is Robert Graysmith's real name is Robert G. Smith II. That doesn't necessarily prove that Robert Graysmith created the 408 cryptogram, but it's obvious that the person who did create it was pointing some sort of finger at Robert Smith Jr., who had just started working at the Chronicle a couple of months before these letters started showing up. So those were the things I began to notice, truth versus lie, and the things that we began to uncover. Now, it turns out that this Hal Snook, according to his Army records, during World War II, he served with an elite unit in the South Pacific Theater fighting against the Japanese and very often being parachuted behind the lines. He was a member of a group of commandos, if you will. Some of them were people who went on to form the OSS, who then went on to form the CIA. And Snook fought alongside or in cooperation with a lot of these people, and he was trained especially in communications. But he was also trained in doing things like one of the senior officers in this network of agents operating behind Japanese lines. He's the fellow who invented the roadside bomb made with fertilizer and diesel fuel. And so Snook was trained not only in how to build those kind of bombs, but he trained other people to build those kind of bombs, and it's identical to the design of the bomb that was threatened to be used against a school bus in one of those letters, the so-called bus bomb letter. And a lot of the weird characters that he uses in his ciphers, in those cryptograms, they're not only, generally speaking, it's an alphabet, and I can't believe any of these self-appointed experts, and some of them are genuine experts. Supposedly, no one before me ever noticed that those characters come from a language called Cebuano, and it's a very specific dialect of Cebuano called Askaya, which is used by a tribe of Tagalog people in the Mindanao island chain, and they have been cooperating with the U.S. government and U.S. corporations since before the Spanish-American War. And this covert group destabilizing the Spanish colonial government and then helping to fight against communist insurgents in that region. And these are exactly the people that Hal Snook served with and served alongside and served in aid of during the Second World War. So it's just every little thing. A lot of the so-called misspelled words in the Zodiac letters aren't misspelled at all. They are correctly spelled. For example, the word Cirrus, there's one of the famous letters has a very short cryptogram, and it says, "My name is," and then there's this little short cryptogram. And later on in that letter, the author says, "I'm mildly serious as to how much money you have on my head." That word Cirrus is not curious misspelled. Cirrus is a reference to a chemical called Cirrus oxalate. Cirrus oxalate was a chemical well known to Hal Snook. He was a chemist. He'd been taught chemistry in the Army. He got his degree in journalism from San Jose State, and that turns out to be important later. But he was a chemist. During the war, he used Cirrus oxalate for several purposes. After the war, I should mention, Hal was a famous rock hound and fossil collector. I used to own one of his fossils he collected from Wyoming. Cirrus oxalate is a very common chemical. Anybody who ever had a rock polisher when they were a kid, or anybody who polishes gemstones or polishes rocks, that's the chemical you use, is Cirrus oxalate. But it has other uses. Cirrus oxalate was used before Dramamine was discovered to treat motion sickness, seasickness, air sickness, and it was especially given to paratroopers and kamikaze pilots because it temporarily sedates a person's fear of death. So he used that as a paratrooper. And last but not least, Cirrus oxalate was also used by various spy agencies as an invisible ink. So almost every word, let alone every weird symbol, and the circled crosshair symbol, there's so much of material in those letters and cryptograms that Hal Snook is almost the only person in the whole world who could have written those materials, and by golly, his handprinting turns out to be an absolute perfect match.
So what you're saying for our listeners is that Hal Snook, who was not looked at as a possibility of being one of the murderers or the cabal of the Zodiac murderers, whoever they were, he was never looked at. He was never one of the suspects. He was never named. But he has all these characteristics of the very language or the alphabet that is being used in the cryptogram for the Zodiac killer, which was used in the Philippines by people that he also worked alongside of. These languages you mentioned, Oskaya, and the other Filipino language used by, as you mentioned to me personally, Filipino guerrillas who were working with the OSS that became the CIA. And so then he's now a police officer in the very place where it is insinuated the whole thing began and might have even been coordinated out of. And now you're stating he has capacities that only a CIA-trained person or someone who was working with the CIA might have. And he might have also been working with Graysmith, seeing that Graysmith appears as a name in one of the cryptograms. Now, let's get straight to how did you all of a sudden get an aha moment that you have discovered this, and then let's get straight to what the text says, which then proves everything that you've been researching and investigating for all these years and writing in books. So how is it that you and your friends, cryptographers, as a matter of fact, the reason I came to speak with you is because one of my good friends over at Cicada 3301, who we're going to be launching their new cryptology puzzle on our site very soon, they've helped us. And a couple of them have become official members of our Anonymous Patriots Conclave group. So when I have problems, I can call them or chat with them, and they give me answers that show they're very smart and they're cryptologists. As you probably know, I think one of them might have told you I was in the NSA at one point in the ancient days, and I was a cryptologist and a traffic analyst, and I was in electronic warfare. So this is all super interesting to me. So when he called me up and said, look, you got to talk to Professor Thomas, I said, oh, I absolutely do. This is amazing. So how is it? What was this aha moment? You've been writing these books for 7 years. I don't know how long you've been studying it, but and by the way, interesting that you're fresh eyes from a fresh approach, but with your very honed investigative skills of an insurance investigator. Now, mind you, listeners, there's no one more shrewd than an insurance investigator. They've seen every scam there is, and twice that. And you're not going to fool them, okay? Their job is to catch the scam, and they've seen every scam. So you've seen that, as well as you're analyzing this as an English professor, and you saw this extreme discrepancy simply in the writing style, the skill, and also then the handwriting, which you quickly did a simple analysis of with experts, and boom, you found the person you think is the person. But what was the moment? Did you get some special cryptologist like they have over there at Cicada 3301 to help you, or who was it? I can't ask you probably directly on air. Who were these genius cryptologists that finally figured this out? Because I know that you figured out the last key that they couldn't figure out, which is just amazing, which you can fill us in on.
Well, I have had a lot of help, and I have had contact with members of this group, the Cicada 3301. I don't know who they are. The only two names I even know, I know there's a fellow named Thomas, and I think we're familiar with the same
I
fellow.
think we're all named Thomas, aren't we, Thomas?
Yeah, and then my name happens to be Thomas. And then there was another fellow, Ian Murdoch. I'm not even sure he's still alive.
He has passed
Those
away.
are the only names I know. So I've been in contact with them. They operate over my head for sure. But once we figured out that Hal Snook was the guy who wrote this, one of my readers and one of my fans, who knows, maybe the member of Cicada 3301, and I just don't know. I have no idea. But he contacted me and said, look what I found. And he found people who have been working on the 340, they make certain assumptions, and they've run into certain difficulties. And one of the things that I've learned, you mentioned I used to be an insurance investigator, and I still do some private investigation on the side. I got trained in reviewing police investigations, and one of the main things I used to do is go through a homicide investigation and see if, and we would advise the police department, you got a shot at getting a conviction or not. So I'm very familiar with the rules of evidence. And one thing I learned is you never make assumptions. You never don't confuse hunches with facts and things like that. So when people read my books, what I put in the books is documented by nothing but original police files, autopsy reports, things like that. And the other thing I learned was, I've lost my train of thought. The other thing I learned was there are sources of information. So I'm looking at this and, what I learned was when somebody writes a letter, they intend for somebody to read it. So this message that he absolutely demanded be printed on the front page of the newspapers, he intended for someone to read it. And therefore, it couldn't have been something he created all by himself. Because if he wanted to communicate a message to someone he was in direct contact with, he would just communicate with them directly. He was wanting to communicate a very important message, a time-sensitive message, to a person that he knew would recognize the encryption method, but he had to know that no one else would recognize it. Now, using those Soblano symbols, using those Iskaya symbols, and there are lots of other clues that the person writing this letter was associated with this underground group called the Philippine Scouts. He had to know somebody at CIA or NSA would recognize that. So he must have used a method. They might recognize the method. They might have a hunch who the author was, but it had to be done in such a way that even they couldn't decrypt it. And there was a person who contacted me and said, you're going to think I'm crazy, but the 340 is not a regular substitution cipher. He used a technical term called a hash string encryption method. And I said, well, coincidentally enough, we found this training manual that was used before these new digital encryption schemes came online, so all the way during the first half of the 20th century and all the way through World War II, that Snook used in his work. And it includes, among other methods, what we now call a hash string. The second problem people have had in trying to decrypt the 340, I was able to recognize just dumb luck. I happen to be familiar with this language because another person had contacted me and said, I have a hunch that it's the plain text, the original text is in more than one language. And I said, yeah, it is. It's English and Japanese. It's a mixture of English and Japanese. That's one reason why the computers have had such a hard time cracking it, because it's a mixture of English and Japanese and probably some Tagalog words as well. There are a couple words I can't make out. So those were the difficulties. But once we found this training manual that Snook was trained in, then we came up with a decryption. I'm waiting for verification, but it just, and again, it comes back to this question. He was sending a message to a particular person at a particular time who would be able to decrypt it, but someone he could not communicate with directly, or knew that if he tried to communicate with directly, they'd get caught. So a lot of spies, they use the newspapers or they use radio, or like maybe they'd plan a personal ad or something like this. This is a much longer message. So it had to be someone who would recognize it and keep their eyes open for the next message, and it had to be time sensitive because he was in a big hurry to get these things published at a certain time. And it had to be something that his fellow agents who had joined the CIA, who had joined the NSA, they would know it, but they would not be able, especially with the technology they had in the 60s, they would not be able to decrypt the message themselves. And who knows, maybe it was a person within one of those agencies. That might be his intended recipient, but he had to make sure he had to make sure they would notice it, they would recognize it, that they would decrypt it, but they had to make sure that no one else would be able to do it. And if you read that manual, that technical manual, which was just recently declassified, this is how this guy dug it up. That's what we used to come up with we have a pretty solid decryption of the 340, and it fits into this idea that, why on earth would somebody create this sensation, and why would they insist on getting the ciphers published on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle? Now, it turns out, another interesting fact of Hal Snook's life, when he got out of the Army, he went to San Jose State on the GI Bill, and he got his degree in journalism. And while he was there, one of his dorm mates and fellow classmates in the English journalism program happened to be a young World War II hero from the Pacific War named Anthony Poshepny, who most people know as Tony Poe, and some people say might have been the inspiration to real-life Colonel Kurtz, the John Milius character he created for the movie Apocalypse Now. Well, he and Snook went to college together, and apparently they even lived in the same dorm building. So I wondered if maybe the 340 had been a message intended for this Tony Poe. And the decryption we have so far, and I want verification. I never publish things unless I can prove it 6 ways in court, but seems to have been exactly the type of message I think he might have wanted Poe to receive, because right after this Zodiac brouhaha and all these letters and cryptograms are published in the Chronicle, it's just, it's way less than 2 months later. It's within 4 to 6 weeks that Poe is yanked out of the jungles of Cambodia and shoved behind a desk in Thailand. So I'm pretty sure he was the intended recipient for this message, and the message as we decoded it sure looks like it. And it's just by coincidence, another one of those amazing coincidences, the result of all this seems to have been that Poe was yanked out of the field and stuck behind a desk for the rest of his career. So it all fits, and it all fits perfectly. And once I identified Hal Snook as the author of the letters, all the other pieces literally fell into place. There's almost no room for doubt about any of it at this point. The only question left is, did he commit any of the Zodiac murders? And
this case is still open, right?
Well, sort of. People don't realize the first 2 kids who got shot, the first official, leaving out the Sherry Joe Bates murder, the 2 kids who were shot on Lake Herman Road, December of 1968, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, That case is considered closed by the Benicia Police Department. They had informants. They had these two guys, the Donahue brothers, and they were jailhouse snitches. They were awaiting trial on a separate murder charge. But they told detectives, we were there that night, and they gave the detectives a lot of information that the Zodiac never gave them. They described the victim's clothing and everything. And they said that they were accomplices to this guy who, he is no doubt guilty of several other murders. He was finally, but see, he was an informant. He was a high-value informant. He got away with a lot of murders back in the day. He's finally been indicted by the feds on interstate narcotics trafficking and conspiracy and things like that, but separate charges from the murders he undoubtedly committed in the 60s. They've always considered him to be, they've always considered the case to have been solved. Now, it's funny, the Zodiac didn't write a letter about that murder for many, many months. It's not until the Blue Rock Springs shooting, but one of the lies Graysmith tells in his book is the police had no good suspects in these murders, and that's baloney. They did have excellent suspects in each of those murders. The second lie he tells in his books is that the evidence pointed to a single serial killer. That's a lie. There was a lot more evidence collected in each of those murder cases than Graysmith admitted, including fingerprints. And none of the fingerprints match from any of the crime scenes, and none of the fingerprints found at any of the crime scenes match any fingerprints found on the letters. And last but not least, the witness descriptions actually are distinctly different. Mike Michaud got a good look at, it might have been more than one shooter at Blue Rock Springs Park. He got a good look at one of the shooters. That description that he gives perfectly describes Darlene Farron's ex-husband. Doesn't mean he's guilty, but he's certainly the prime suspect, and he certainly had a motive, and he certainly fits the description. And then, of course, the assailant at the lake, that's a completely different physical description. And then the three kids who got a really, really good long look at the guy who shot Paul Stein, the taxi driver, and we have a very detailed composite sketch. That's a completely different person. We know all that. Now, it turns out that Hal Snook, who was very careful not to have his picture taken very often, we finally dug up his official... After he graduated from San Jose State and he worked at a couple of newspapers, he re-upped for the Korean War and he joined the Air Force as an officer. And we found his official Air Force photograph, and you've seen that. And as you can see, he is an absolute dead ringer. Of all the potential suspects in the shooting of Paul Stein, Hal Snook's face actually fits that sketch to an absolute perfect T, including the droopy eye and the widow's peak and all of that stuff. So it's beginning to look like maybe he did shoot the cab driver. And why would he do that is what we're getting into. So,
well, let's get straight to your decryption. What is it that the 340 says, according to what you still need to have confirmed by other cryptologists, but so far multiple cryptologists as well as yourself seeing what the words say, even I seeing what the words say?
Well, if anybody, I have rivals. There are people who claim... Right, and the funny thing is, like I said, everything I publish, I can prove 6 ways for Sunday. None of these so-called experts. To give you a counterexample, the most recent was this guy who claimed his father was the Zodiac, and within a week or two, Tom Voigt had proven that the handwriting samples didn't belong to this guy's father. The handwriting samples belonged to the preacher who had performed the wedding ceremony. So all of these other suspects, even the frame around Arthur Lee Allen, has been thoroughly debunked. No one's been able to debunk a single word of all 3 of my books. So if you insist, I will let me look at my notes here. This is not a perfect decryption. I'm not claiming it's a perfect decryption.
I don't insist. My point is, what is the content of the decryption that tells you
here's the thing.
That this is him stating he is the killer?
Here's the thing. Hal Snook seems to have been a pretty gung-ho narcotics cop. He founded the California Narcotics Officers Association, which is still around. He went around the state training cops. Cops in those days got very little training. These criminal justice programs were a brand new idea, and he was an instructor at this brand new criminal justice program at Napa Valley Junior College. And he went around the state training a lot of cops, and especially the basic chemistry that you need to do narcotics. And he had a case go all the way to the United States Supreme Court, giving evidence saying that this particular batch of meth was manufactured at this particular illegal laboratory. So we also know that Tony Poe was involved in trying to disrupt. He worked with the Hmong anti-communist rebels in the mountains of Cambodia and Laos. And before that, he'd worked in Korea. And they were selling heroin that they were growing themselves to finance their operations, to purchase weapons and supplies. And Poe was okay with that, but there were Vang Pao himself and some of the CIA people were also lining their own pockets with some of the proceeds from the sales of this heroin. They had also promised various Senate committees and whatnot that none of that heroin was ending up on the streets of America. And my hypothesis was, if this message was intended for Poe, that because they'd been friends and they'd maintained contact, and there is a channel, I did find a channel of communication where Poe could have been communicating with Snook, back channel, and then how would Snook get messages back to Poe? And I thought that the basic purpose of the 340 might just be like a go sign. Go ahead with this operation that we've had planned to prove that this heroin was ending up on the streets of America and where some of the money was going. So that was my hunch, that what the 340. But the people I had working on it had no idea what my hunch was. So the decryption that we've all come up with does seem to indicate that this is a message concerning some payment in gold and some other members of the group. As I suspected, Zodiac was actually a call sign for a group of people, and I think these were people that Snook had recruited and trained to help him prove that this heroin was being distributed in the United States illegally. And so some of the information that has come out in this decryption seems to confirm that. I'd actually rather not. Let me see what I don't want to be a tease, but I also like to wait for, and I'm also scrolling through my notes here because I'm looking for...
Well, essentially, you've already told us who is named as at least one of the killers. And what I was going to say is, isn't your life in danger? Because from what I read from this, it seems pretty clear what was going on, and what's going on, for all I know, could still be going on to this day.
Well, I don't think so, because I've survived cancer, I've been shot at, I've been struck by lightning.
Oh, well, okay, if you've been struck by lightning, you shouldn't have any worries.
Number one, somebody or something's going to get me, and if I end up dead, if my car blows up tomorrow, that's not going to prove these guys are innocent. It's going to prove they're guilty. So I think probably the stupidest thing would be for these guys to try to rub me out now. So, and you'd be wasting your time. I'm already getting up there in years, and it's sooner or later anyway.
And you've already written the books. I mean, essentially.
Well, and there was somebody else who contacted me and said that they had thought they had done a partial decryption based on this idea of the hash string, and said they thought it might have referred to the famous Yamashita gold, which was this gold that the Japanese Imperial Army had stolen all over Asia and was on its way back to Japan, and they start losing the war, so they stash it around the Philippines. And there is a reference to gold in this decryption of the 340, but the name Snook appears twice in our decryption, and the person who came up with this had no idea what that word meant. They said
that's not
right.
An
they
accident.
didn't even know it was a.
You cannot
right,
come
they didn't
up
even
with
know
two
it was a
names
name.
in a cryptogram the same by accident. That's not going to happen.
Right, and there are a lot of null characters, and a lot of the it's an old encryption method that's kind of similar to a crossword puzzle. So most of the characters are actually null characters, and sometimes they're clues as to which direction you go. So many letters to the right, so many letters to the downward diagonal to the left, so many letters up. The full name Ken Snook appears, and Hal's full name was Harold Kenneth Snook Jr. So the name Ken Snook appears, and then at the very end, as though possibly signed by him, the last line seems to decrypt, got real cop Napa involved Zodiac Snook. So they're either identifying him as a cop in Napa who's involved in the plan, or it's signed Snook, in the same way that the 408 appears to be signed Robert E. Smith II. The 340 seems to be signed Snook. So the name Ken Snook appears above, and then the last line, got real cop Napa involved Zodiac Snook. So it could be either Snook is involved in Zodiac and Napa, which would be true, or it's got real cop Napa involved Zodiac, signed Snook. So we've got a lot, there's a lot more in there that, and there is the other real suspects in the real murders. They were all personally known to Snook. And what's interesting about Jim Phillips, Darlene's ex-husband, is that he'd been adopted by a couple in Northern California, and his adopted father was Diamond Bell Phillips. Now, Bell is not a middle name. Bell Phillips is a hyphenated name. And this was a clan of people who had went west in the late 1800s to make their fortune. And Hal Snook's mother was Diamond Bell's aunt. Hal Snook's mother, Mary Bell Phillips, is her nephew is Diamond Bell Phillips, and that would make him Hal's cousin, and that meant that Jim Phillips was Hal's second cousin by adoption. And when Hal got out of the Army and got his journalism degree from San Jose State, he went north, not too far from where Diamond was living, and took over two small-town newspapers that had gone bankrupt for a couple of years, and he had to have someplace to stay, and apparently he stayed with Diamond. So he's related to that prime suspect. I'm not saying I can prove in court that Jim Phillips murdered his ex-wife. What I'm saying is he's the prime suspect in that shooting, and he happens to be closely acquainted with Hal Snook. And the actual prime suspect in the Lake Berryessa stabbing is the park ranger who came along and discovered the victims. That's Dennis Land, who was a close personal friend of Hal Snook. Hal mentored certain young men, and one of his first students at Napa Valley Junior College in the criminal justice program is Dennis Land. And Dennis Land turns out to be the prime suspect in the stabbing at Lake Berryessa.
So
then Hal...
Could Hal
right,
be
and then
covering for a whole cabal
right.
of people who have killed by accident or by design, and then actually running what you'd call a dark cabal? I mean, an evil cabal within the police department? Is that what you think that might be possible in your hypothesis?
Well, because it looks like David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were murdered, whether they were informants or not. Now, it's possible, especially David, because he got into... It didn't turn into a fight because the other guy chickened and ran away. People don't realize that David Faraday was, he was a local champion wrestler and real tough kid, but also, a real good kid. He was an explorer scout. And he had almost got into a fight, except the other kid chickened out with a punk who David said was selling drugs at David's high school. And that would be this other guy, the FBI informant. It would be his younger brother. And so a lot of people did think that David was cooperating with police and trying to put a stop to some of this drug dealing. What people don't hear from Gray Smith is that parking lot where David and Betty Lou got shot. That was a dumping ground. I've had retired cops tell me they found over a dozen bodies dumped out there. And they know who did it. They know it was the Hells Angels and their associates in the Vallejo area were whacking people who were snitches or who they thought were snitches. And as far as Benicia police are concerned, they're convinced that this gang assumed that David and Betty Lou had gone out there as informants or something. Whether they were or not, that was probably the motive. So, and then Darlene and Mike were almost definitely in that park to do some kind of drug deal, and it's very possible Mike was most likely an informant. He was a petty criminal. He had a record. And as you can read in my books, there were two undercover narcotics cops who were at that parking lot at the exact same time of the shooting. They both pretended they didn't see Darlene's car there. So what apparently happened there was either they set up Darlene and Mike to get shot because they were informants, or maybe more likely they blundered into the scene 5 minutes too early, and this gang saw them there and put two and two together and pulled in the parking lot, shot Mike and Darlene. So that's probably what happened there. Now, what about the two kids at Lake Berryessa? Now, Dennis Land turns out to be the prime suspect in some other murders of women in the area. So, but he was the one who would be maybe the closest personal friend of Hal Snook's.
Well, this is incredible what you've discovered. You know, what you need to do is make a TV series out of this, or a movie. Are you going to put this in your next book? Is this going to be in a book? Are you going to let people know this? And are you going to decode the other three ciphers or cryptograms, or at least the messages that have yet to be decoded. Are you going to be able to apply this to those other three?
Now that we know the method, because again, I'm pretty sure that they were intended to be read by someone. Now, there are two ways of doing that. You prearrange it in advance so that you both have the hash key, or there are ways of transmitting that information in the clear by embedding it in the letters or whatever. Now that we know the method, I do think there's a good chance we'll decrypt the other cryptograms. And we also think that the original 408, which seemed easy to crack, it's very, very possible there's another level of meaning. There's another level of decryption that you would go through and reveal the real. And he created that easy version. But the thing is, even in that 408, the reference to this cult in the Philippines, the blank I have killed to become my slaves in the afterlife, those were the people how Snook fought alongside and was helping to train to fight the Japanese and to fight against communist insurgents. So, and there's so many. In the second letter, he signs the second letter. People think it says no address, but if you look very carefully, if you look at the full color photographs, high-res photographs of that letter, there's a lowercase I in there, and it says, I know address. And it might also say, the way the words are broken up, I know air defense radar emission simulator set. That's a technical term for people who, if you know anything about antique radar, a lot of references in the letters to Mount Diablo. What was on top of Mount Diablo was a radio emission simulator set. It was a special radar transmitter that was used to tune and calibrate various Cold War radar setups. Just an early warning radar. You point your radar dish at this test emitter, and that's how you test and calibrate the receiver circuitry of your radar set. That's specifically what Hal was trained to do during the Korean War. He trained at Fort Lowry, Colorado, Lowry Air Force Base, Colorado, in maintaining and operating truck-mounted radar and repairing that, and repairing the encrypted teletype machines that were used to communicate back to base, a system called SIGCOM. And so that again fits right in with, and all those references to Mount Diablo, it's still there. I don't know if they still use it, but it was Mount Hum. There's some other mountain where they still had this concrete bunker where they had this chain of radar, but the test set, the test radar beacon that they would use to tune and calibrate their radar setups was on top of Mount Diablo. And that's not the only connection that Snook has to Mount Diablo, but that's one of them. So there are references, the electric gun site baloney about the shooting at Lake Herman Road, that actually, when you look at these training manuals, the training that Snook received in the 1950s, what he's referring to is radar-guided anti-aircraft. And why is he mentioning all that? I have no idea. It seems like there are a lot. Every word of those letters, every word of those cryptograms has two or three meanings, and they all point directly to Hal Snook. And his handwriting is a perfect match. It isn't just the general shape of the letters. When you look at the handwriting analysis, and I've had two so-called experts agree with me on that. And then on top of all of that, he does look exactly like the composite sketch of the killer of Paul Stein. So all that new information and identifying him as the possible shooter of Stein, that's all going to come out in one new book. I've broken it up into 3 books for potential legal reasons, like exposing Graysmith as a fraud meant I had to quote many paragraphs of his book. Well, on one level, that's potential plagiarism. I claim fair use because I'm debunking a so-called nonfiction book. So his lawyers and his agent, they went over it with a fine-tooth comb. Amazon's lawyers went over it with a fine-tooth comb. So far, no one's complained, but just in case, right? So I put that in a separate book where and I recommend people read that book first. It's called The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986 by Thomas Henry Horan, Horan. Read that book first, because everything everybody thinks they know about the Zodiac Killer comes from Graysmith's book, and that includes Fincher's movie. Once you realize Graysmith's book is an out-and-out fraud, realize you have to start over. Well, we have those original case files we can study, and I do that in The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969, where who all the real suspects were, what really happened in those murder cases, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a third book, which is an academic book I set out to write in the first place. We just puts the Zodiac Killer letters in this historical context, the history, not only of vigilante journalism at the Chronicle. People don't realize all the top columnists at the Chronicle were writing each other fake letters. There was a columnist at the Examiner, which was owned by the same company as the Chronicle. They worked in the same building. They shared a printing plant. He was writing fake postcards from around the world, pretending he was going around the world. Paul Avery wrote an expose of a reporter at the Examiner who was filing fake news reports about Richard Nixon's trip to China, and the guy had never gotten on the plane, didn't go to China with Nixon. So all this stuff that book is called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. That's the one so that's kind of optional as far as I'm concerned. That's the scholarly book I started writing. But The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, I suggest you start there, and then The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969, and then the fourth book, where I lay out the case that Snook was maybe the killer, is going to be called I Like Killing People.
Wow.
And that'll be out, it'll definitely be out by December 20th. I'm going to try to have that out in July. And then there will be, I'm going to go ahead and come out with one book. It might be easier for people, but again, just in case there's a fuss and Amazon doesn't want to publish part of I'll just leave it in 3 separate pieces. That way you don't have to pay the full price if you don't care about some of the information. So that's the thing. That message, I like killing people. Maybe it's true. Maybe he got a taste for killing people during the war. He couldn't stop. That happens to some people. And if he thought the people he was killing deserved it, then that might be an excuse, or seems like maybe there was a group of them, or whatever. So that'll be in a book called I Like Killing People. That'll be coming out in a few weeks.
Wow. This is amazing.
And yes, I am talking to a couple of TV networks and cable networks about a documentary series.
I would hope so, because you are you're definitely ready for primetime television and a movie, because the fascination with the Zodiac Killer is probably the greatest of any of these unsolved serial killings, because just as you've pointed out, who knows? So many people have speculated, and yet you're the only one that's made sense. I looked at all of them before I chatted with you, and everything you've said is absolutely point on. And I appreciate the fact that what you're doing is giving us a conservative view until you, in fact, absolutely verify this. So as you say, you could go and print it and not be sued. Well, this is exactly what's necessary for really getting resolve on this case, not just because it's an unsolved mystery and it's something that can go on a miniseries or a movie, but because people need it to be resolved. These are 37 supposed connected to the Zodiac Killer deaths that have never been resolved. And you seem to know them as if you're ready to just go out and write the screenplay right now. No, it needs to be a little bit to the left. No, there's a car over there.
Right. And the other thing is there are at least 5 victims and 2 survivors who they and their families never got any justice. And there's something wrong with that. And so me doing this, sure, there's a commercial potential. That's true. But I don't want to, if Hal Snook didn't shoot the cab driver, I'll be the first person to admit it, but all the evidence points squarely at him. There's no doubt he wrote the first 4 Zodiac letters and some of the letters after that. There's also very little doubt there were other people who took over writing the letters. And Gray Smith himself built such a case against himself. Once you learn about Gray Smith's real life story, for example, Gray Smith grew up, most of the time he grew up in Japan. And for a long time, his father, Colonel Robert Smith Sr., the 6400th Air Materiel Command, Tachikawa Air Force Base, Japan, while they lived there, 12-year-old Bobby Smith Jr. got his first job at a newspaper, and he knew what he was doing. He did graphics. He covered the sports desk. He knew what he was doing. Somebody taught him the fundamentals of the newspaper business. And by the greatest coincidence I've ever heard of, there was a Lieutenant Hal Snook who was also attached to the 6400th repairing radar sets, and he was stationed at Tachikawa, Japan. And the funny thing about Graysmith's book is every cop who ever sneezed on a piece of paper that had anything to do with the Zodiac killer got his name spelled correctly in Graysmith's book. But the cop who collected the shoe prints, the so-called Wingwalker shoe prints, and by the way, that was only one brand of shoe that used that sole. You read about that in the book. The one who collected all this evidence at the scene at Lake Berryessa, the fellow who was the consultant who worked on Fincher's film, that's Hal Snook, and Graysmith doesn't mention his name in his book at all.
This is incredible.
So
incredible what you.
And there's lots of other evidence that points directly. What Graysmith doesn't tell people is he was not an editorial cartoonist. He drew some editorial cartoons, but Graysmith was the guy who ran what we call a repro camera, using reproductive film. It's a special camera with a non-distorting lens, uses special repro film. For example, the Zodiac killer letters and cryptograms weren't just written with a blue pen. They were written with a very specific type of blue felt tip pen called repro blue. There are two types of lithographic reproductive film. They're still used today. One is sensitive to blue light, one is sensitive to red light. So when the letters were published on the front pages of the papers, they showed up black. That's because the author used a repro blue pen, and the camera operator would use film that was sensitive to red light. Now, what's important about that is the copycat slayer at Lake Berryessa didn't know that. So he brought a black felt tip pen with him to the crime scene because he had no idea he was supposed to use repro blue. That's one of the clues that we know that was actually a copycat slang. It's things like that Graysmith points a finger squarely at himself. And again, that last 18 letters of the 408 don't spell Robert Emmett the hippie. They spell Robert E. Smith II. And I always thought it was kind of weird that Robert Graysmith never recognized his own name all those years he spent writing that book and playing with those ciphers. He supposedly never recognized his own name. And there are a lot of other facts about his life that come out that actually tend to make him look a lot more guilty than he ever admitted. So I think he had a lot to do with creating the cryptograms, because that's not Snook's handwriting, but it's Snook's skills, it's Snook's training, it's Snook's knowledge.
So it's a group of people. So tell me, do you think your revelation will be received well by the police of San Francisco and Northern California?
They don't actually care. The only detective I ever talked to who still cared was Pat McMahon at Napa, and he working the Shepard case, the Lake Berryessa case, on a cold case crime. He was very familiar, and he was very interested. At that time, I didn't know the handwriting sample belonged to Snook. But San Francisco, those other police departments, in their press releases, they say the case is open. They couldn't possibly care less, and I don't blame them. But the victims and their families do. Darlene's little girl, Deanna, she never knew her mother, and her family never got any justice for that murder. And it doesn't matter who these people were. Their families didn't deserve to have their family members murdered, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not right that people have cashed in, and these people never got any justice. So now there have been people who contacted me who said, and people sued Graysmith and his publisher. Arthur Lee Allen's family did not believe he was the Zodiac. And when you watch that movie, when you read the book, they supposedly suspect, no, that was all lies. So they sued, they settled out of court. Some of the police officers involved settled out of court. Everybody knows Dave Toschi never kept his mouth shut, but when I would ask some of these reporters, Toschi told me this, Toschi told me that. Really? What did Armstrong tell you? And they just hang up the phone, because Armstrong obviously did not believe that in the Zodiac. So, I strongly suggest read the books. It's all fully documented. The footnotes in the books are clickable links. They take you to a completely free website where you see the documents for yourself. If you email me, I'd be glad to send you. It's a big zip file. I need a Gmail address. I'll send you this huge zip file that has all the hundreds and hundreds of pages. I'm the only self-proclaimed Zodiac expert who bothered to read them all, and I'm the only one who bothered to sort them and collate them and put them in order so people can read them. So I give that to people free. So
how do they
I really suggest. Well, they can. I also host a podcast now called the Stones Unturned Podcast. You can find that, or you can find, if you just Google Zodiac Killer Hoax, Thomas Horan, Horan. You'll find the website. The website won't make much sense if you haven't read the books, and I have a tendency not to answer questions until you read the books. I am a teacher, and I do expect you to read the book before you ask the questions, and then read the book because it's all completely documented. I don't make any claims unless I can prove it 6 ways for Sunday. So,
well, I can tell you one
Zodiac
thing.
expert. Yeah, Mike Morford tried to debate me on the facts of the cases on one podcast, and he just had no chance because I have all the facts on my side.
Obviously, you do. And by
yeah.
the way, I want to confirm your top secret release from the government. That book that you look at, that was the way that we were taught. That's the way we were taught cryptology. And we weren't taught by machines, though I went into the machines. But it was exactly that. These hash trees, these hash lines, matter of fact, that I'm going to give a little talk probably tomorrow about what the Conclave and I came up with looking at the old cryptogram and the way that coincides exactly with what you say. Not that we could break it out. We knew we couldn't, but we knew certain components, and you've described all of them. So we want to thank you for choosing us and for Cicada 3301 for connecting you and all those people who've called you to help you. Please, people, keep calling Thomas. Keep helping him. These people deserve justice, and this case needs to be closed, but closed with justice, and we need to know the truth of it. So we salute your work. Can't wait for your new book coming out. And the other thing, people, contact Thomas. That's how we find things out, is using the internet for what it's for, freedom of information, as long as we still have it. So let's work on this case together. We want to thank you again, and hopefully we will chat with you as it gets closer to the time of you doing your book, because by then you will have probably completely confirmed this and done the other translations and decoding, decryptions of the other notes, and can fill in even more details. But it sounds as if you have figured out the keystone. You not only figured out the key to the cryptogram, you actually figured out who was the kingpin, who was the linchpin of this whole scenario, and also who was the journalist linchpin of it, and the way that they linked together, and also your connections to the Philippines and the OSS. These are very deep things that I know you won't go into on the air because so much of it is speculation, but we're going to go ahead and speculate a little bit about this tomorrow, some Conclave members, because what you have brought forward is a huge revelation. People may not realize it, but if you see all the ramifications of what you've done, people who are listening to this, what Thomas has done, this is an amazing revelation, and it shows you the way that things really work. So thank you again for your astounding revelation here, and I'm glad that you did hold back the words, to be quite frank with you. I'm not going to give out these words because...
Well, I would like to get a chance. Everything I've talked about, I can prove. Mm-hmm. I don't want to release the full decryption yet because I want a chance for people like you and any other experts you can contact. Now that we know the method, like, for example, if you know that you need to know the length of the string, maybe it's 12 characters long, and that's your first clue. Some of those numbers, like when he signs his letters and he supposedly gives a score of like 37 victims, I'm wondering if 37 isn't one of the string lengths, or there's some clue there that would help a person with decrypt that message. So now that we know the method, and I think we do, then maybe there's a whole other layer to the 408. And anyone else who's listening, if you knew Hal Snook, if you knew any of these people, don't be afraid to contact me and think I'm going to think you're crazy. I don't care how crazy you are. If you have information, you have information. If someone can prove me wrong, I'll be the first person to admit it. I don't want to falsely accuse anybody of anything. So if you knew Jim Phillips Crabtree, if you knew Hal Snook, if you knew Dennis Land or Ray Land, some of these people are still alive. Some of them talk to me, some of them don't. If you knew Philip Stewart, who was sheriff for a while, if you knew any of those people, please don't hesitate. If you knew Ben Villarreal, he's still alive. He doesn't answer my phone calls. He's a police officer in Vallejo. If you knew these people, please don't hesitate to contact me. I still have an open mind, and if you can prove me wrong about any of this, I'll be the first person to publish that. So thank you very much for having me on your show.
We're patriots for truth, and obviously you're an investigator for truth, and that's why we recognize you as a true kindred spirit. Thank you so much, Thomas, for having this conversation with us.